Hi everybody, it's me, Noobster. So today I'm going to react with my agreements and disagreements to AutomaticJak's recent video about the upcoming changes in Midnight to healers and healing. I'm gonna need some therapy. Blizzard's post, I don't know. There were some different names, but what I see is Blizzard listened to healers as the title of the video. And I wouldn't be so sure to say that personally. I do agree a good amount with Jak, but I believe in having some more skepticism over the changes Blizzard is suggesting to healer specs in Midnight, and also them making good on the promise that they've made several times now to kind of slow down healing that they've never quite actually fulfilled.
Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jak. Back again to talk about the healer changes that they've proposed for the Midnight expansion, and also relating it to our last video on healing that we made a month ago, talking about how healing needed to change. The three main factors I talked about in that video: the raid cooldown, sort of spam, where you would just layer multiple raid cooldowns on top of each other to deal with damage. The bloat was definitely with how many different modifiers and trackers and things that you need to juggle between to actually make your spells do real healing, and the lack of like priority.
I did watch the video. Priority healing, huh? So Jak recaps on his previous video, which I did watch. Those 3 points actually weren't my main takeaway from the video. He spoke on defensives quite a lot, but it's been a while, so I agree and disagree with these 3 points in some way. I think they could be more particular or specific. The main 3 things I have been worried about for a while now, like since Shadowlands, would be number 1, enemy damage profiles. It meshes with what he's kind of talking about, that you have this spiky damage, but not only that, it's that you are aiming to heal one damage event that happens whatever amount of time, every 30 seconds or so, and there's just nothing else happening in between. Having the sustained damage and how you react to it, the fluidity. Number 2 would be consequence. I think that there is an issue with what the consequences are of players need to fail. A failure should be done in a healthy way that drives players to get better. You know, I think we've all been in a dungeon where the healer dies and you go 2-3 minutes to finish a boss fight and you didn't even need the healer. Like, that just doesn't really happen when there is sustained damage happening. You look back at BFA and that's just not really how things worked, right? But now, the importance of a healer and the consequence of what am I pressing, or understanding your class, just doesn't exactly exist in healthy of a way as it did previously. Number 3, I think that the talent tree rework was not healthy for healers. It probably damaged that role the most of the 3 roles. The talent tree rework for a lot of classes forced us into picking our spec identity versus starting with a spec identity and then improving things from there and letting us, you know, makeshift what we enjoy most out of the game from a specific base to our spec. But let's head onwards for the rest of the video. We'll talk more about these things.
So, I'm very pleased to see this blue post by Blizzard. They say they know that in the War Within, healing is generally very fast-paced, and healing spells can rapidly shift your raid from a severely damaged state to nearly full health in a matter of seconds. It is stressful to react to rapidly changing health bars, and is very intimidating for newer healers what they should be doing at any moment. Healers have a large variety of high power cooldowns that they can rotate through to handle basically every major damage event that they encounter. So in Midnight, we have made some changes with a goal of slowing down the rate at which you can heal up a party or raid member from a severely injured state. There was some confusion I've seen from people talking about the pre-planning side, and what they really mean by this is that you had such a wealth of cooldowns as a healer in the War Within that every single time a mechanic comes out, you would just say, oh, this mechanic comes out, I use this cooldown.
So there's a few nuanced parts to this that are concerning. I don't feel that Blizzard's blue posts and explanations are hitting the nail on the head of me thinking you understand. I agree that the talent reworks gave just so much. I think if we think about it, it's more to do with the damage profile that things feel just awkward, like that I can't heal outside of a cooldown. And it's a difference of philosophy about what the cooldown is for and how Blizzard tunes that, right? So there is some correct aspects that Blizzard needs to allow your healing wave, your flash heal. Those things on their own should do some amount of healing without a modifier. The issue here is in the current state, there isn't necessarily damage going out where you even really need to do that. BFA is the most recent expansion where healing was at an appropriate pace. So they need to think about fight design and damage design. But also in BFA, healing cooldowns were more fluid. And you could even build off of your kind of core set. So Resto Shaman core set had Healing Surge, Healing Wave, Riptide, Chain Heal. In BFA, you're healing with your core kit, what I just mentioned, and then if things get behind, not a major mechanic, but a mistake, there was a lot more fluidity and availability to say, I'm going to use a major healing cooldown right now in reaction. So it's not the cooldown itself that's sitting on your bar that's causing players' playstyles to be that way, because we had a lot of these cooldowns before.
We want healing to require less pre-planning of knowing which cooldown to use at which precise moment. We want there to be less ramp up of complicated ability sequences to get effective output for your healing
ability
spells.
Sequences. Now the pre-planning thing is something that I've been saying for a long time too. I brought up Shadowlands because that is a very key part of where this started. I've been healing a very long time since MOP. I only skipped Legion. I noticed immediately in Shadowlands that things changed a lot. It's that change that we're talking about, especially this pre-planning thing, because the pre-planning has gotten so excessive that you can only really get any HPS if you're staring at a timeline bar, seeing the ability come up 15 to 20 seconds beforehand so you can be the one to heal, because you don't have anything else to do aside from doing that one spot of healing coming up in 20 seconds. I think that the changes that they're talking about, Blizzard specifically, is not understanding the nuance of build-up and ramping. There's definitely a lot of different directions that the issue has gone between Shadowlands trying to say bosses are going to do abilities based on health percentages, so it was too fluid, when at the same time the damage profile was meant for you to ramp. That was a disaster. Thank you, Blizzard. Not thank you. Versus that Cloudburst was very fun to do in BFA, for example, because things were happening in a more regular sense. The timing of boss damage and boss events in BFA was curated and designed much more intentionally than what we've got in any raid tier since. The only other raid tier I would say is similar is I did enjoy Castle Nathria, even though there are some spots of the changes that I dislike, like I said, of certain pre-planning. I do think within the blue post, some of the changes to the healers is too far over the line of we don't want you to ramp to something. And I'm telling you right now, Blizzard, a lot of us like to ramp to things. That is a skill ceiling level that differentiates a player, in raid especially, but in a lot of well-designed fights. Taking away the way that you can kind of show off your knowledge and distinguish yourself as the better healer, I don't think that's gonna go that hot.
Mechanic comes out, I use this cooldown.
Mechanic comes out.
Oh, I actually spooged my cooldowns, used them incorrectly. Well, my sustained healing, my healing outside of cooldowns, is so weak that I can't keep everybody alive, so we just die. And so it makes, you know, even like M+ healing like a spreadsheet type of counter where you say, oh, well, like, oh, I don't have this cooldown for this ability, well, we die.
Spreadsheet design.
Making it so that more so in the past, in previous expansions, where your sustained healing was high, you just had to execute your priority really well to do that high HBS.
Became a game of execution.
More of a priority rather than I have a cooldown, I can't help but win instead.
The execution style design is important. Now, a lot of the differences here of why some things work and why some things don't is a matter of how competitive Blizzard sees certain systems in the game, content that we interact with. Execution style design is very popular for games that a developer is taking very seriously in a competitive sense. MOBAs often do this. That is what becomes at odds with something like an RPG. RPGs, they originate from D&D gameplay. The problem with that base is how easily can you integrate that into competitive type gameplay? Not easily. Not every genre mixes that well together. So with execution, that's where you take away from the fluidity and variability of what I'm talking about, where in BFA, I could say, okay, we messed up a bomb on Jade Fire Masters. I can just use a healing tide here because we're not gonna die if I don't have my healing tide in 30-40 seconds because of this other mechanic. Everything is so kind of equally powerful that it's not going to destroy my raid that I chose to use a healing tide totem because we messed up. And that's the kind of fluidity you don't get with something that's supposed to be punishing and competitive, where you have to execute your tasks perfectly in the correct order.
So what they've been doing is they've been making some major changes, which also align with our previous video. Talent choice nodes. They're now making a variety of major healing cooldowns compete with other major healing cooldowns. For Preservation Evoker, Stasis and Dreamflight are on the same node. Uppies and Barrier on the same node. Holy Prism and Divine Toll are on the same node. Ascendance and Healing Tide, that's a huge one, are on the same node as well.
Cool.
And some abilities outright get removed, like Symbol of Hope.
It's not cool that they're doing that. I just want everyone to know.
Now, this big pruning is on the one hand, I will tell you, it's unequal. I think having Healing Tide competing with Ascendance, but then Holy Priest keeps Divine Hymn and Apotheosis separate is very, very strange.
I agree with that.
Same thing, I think, as well for like Tranquility / Convoke / Tree of Life. Seems really strange that there's like an empowered form that people get the option to have. And
I'm going to say what AutomaticJak really wants to say.
So I don't
I'll
think
be
it's
his anger translator.
Equal, at least at the moment.
I'll be your
anger
translator.
But it also is going to mean that if Shaman, for example, doesn't have their Healing Tide totem, then they need to have really, really high sustained output outside of their Ascendance.
I want to add to this. I'm not sure if he'll talk about it. Part of the part to me of the choice node is the thing is Healing Tide totem and Ascendance are not very comparable. They're just too different, but certain things being compared like that, I don't fully agree with Holy Prism being equal to Divine Toll either. But Healing Tide Totem and Ascendance are way more different. And it's also way more different depending on which hero talent did you pick. That's just off the top of my head. It's like, why would you take this one over that one, depending not only on your hero talents, but the content.
To make up for those kind of things. Or Ascendance needs to hit like a frickin' truck just to make it worthwhile. That being said, I think this is an overall like good change for the game because it makes it less about just like mapping out how you want to use your cooldowns. And I think it makes it alongside a lot of the other talent changes that they made, where they're sort of baking in a lot of like passive effects. This
I'm
makes
not
it so
trying
that
to nitpick
you are
him here,
constantly
but he's talked
real
about
healing and reliable healing out of your spells. Your base healing spells just get brought up and they just naturally do good healing as a result. Those, I think, are some of the really big benefits out of healing going into Midnight, and I think that's sort of like their goal that they have.
This type of healing that we're talking about, where you don't want to do this combo or enhance a heal, is kind of this vanilla to Wrath era thing. The Blue Plus changes make me think that the Classic team kind of conjoined back with the retail team, because I don't think that they have that experience coming into play where they're talking about why you got a big tail, bud. I think they need someone there on the design team talking about this for damage profiles, reanalyzing expansions like post-Cataclysm, to look at times that things were pretty good and what the balance of that was, especially for a slower sustained healing type of gameplay. I gotta say, classic healing is kind of not it. It's insanely boring. Insanely boring. It's not modern gameplay at all. I'd be really surprised if they're gonna try and double down into this.
Their mindset with the short cooldowns, where they say iconic buttons like Prayer of Mending, Wild Growth, Healing Stream Totem still exist and should still be potent on their own. Several modifiers have been adjusted.
Holy. I did not see where in the blue post they put this, but I might crash out at them saying iconic buttons still exist. Blizzard, you removed Tidal Waves and Cloudburst Totem. You removed from Resto Shaman everything that is iconic about Resto Shaman. It's crazy. You guys are wildin'.
In or removed. Prayer of Mending, as an example, was one that had so many different modifiers, and still kind of does, that are increasing its output.
I agree with not having too many modifiers. There's certain classes, especially Priest, and I would argue Paladin, have way too many different modifiers on one spell.
Effects. So they had things like Answered Prayers, which procs your Apotheosis off of Prayer of Mending bounces, just flat out removed, so that you don't have to worry about when you're timing all of your proc effects or when you're predicting when you're getting your Apotheosis. You can start planning around it. And so from the health bars yo-yoing perspective,
I agree. I believe that healers should have varied gameplay, but a healer is not meant for trying to predict when you're going to have something. That's almost why DRE to me is an odd node for the bottom. But yeah, trying to get fishing those procs and trying to time something is tricky. DRE functions not as a big cooldown. It shouldn't be competing with something predictable like Wellspring, in my opinion. DRE functions in healing style similar to BFA boss damage profiles, where things are consistent, that sometimes things can kind of be helped by a random proc like that, and it should be very far in the background, like you're not even thinking about it. So is that talent point thing that you have to remove, or is that, again, Blizzard needs to think about their damage profiles? Depends on what Blizzard wants to do, but I would argue it might be easier to just design bosses and damage profiles a bit better.
Cooldowns means that they're able to have more sort of like deadly damage that can still challenge you. And when you have less cooldowns, your pie chart or your pie of various healing contributors, where do you get your healing from, is also meaning that more of your like chain heal, heal wave, flash heal for Holy Priest are also going to be larger pieces of the pie now, because you're going to have less healing effects that are coming from just random sources, or less healing that's dedicated only into your cooldown windows. And a lot of the write-ups for healers going into this expansion have talked about just that. Paladins, for example, had their write-up saying, we want to remove a lot of this like fluff healing that's kind of coming from nowhere and everywhere, because that doesn't feel satisfying for your spenders.
I'm actually not too sure with his wording. He's talking about deadly damage. The way that I would define deadly damage is kind of these spiky moments. The moments as a Resto Shaman where I'm like, this is a great time to put a Spirit Link down. I think that he is talking maybe more in that BFA sense, where the ticking was heavy enough that if you go more than 5 seconds without healing, someone's going to die to rot. I think he's talking about genuine consequence, which I mentioned earlier. He's talking about consequence for the rot and consequence for healers not healing rot. I do believe that we need to adjust back to what Blizzard thought they were addressing with the criticism of players saying, I didn't finish this boss because my healers didn't heal well enough to the rot. Unfortunately, some of that is the reality of the game, but I do think you need genuine rot damage that players will die to. To clarify, if it's not the case, then the healer's doing nothing important. I think that's just the truth of it, is that healer is a dead job kind of at the moment, and that's why things are in a weird state with who wants to play healer and the community and how they see healers. It's a whole mess.
I know some people see the time to react part. Blizzard says, we want to shift your focus away from rotating through several high power cooldowns to selecting the right spells for the right situations.
I like that.
I've seen a few people posting on social media about it already, about how this
but then you shouldn't have removed tidal waves, should you?
And I really disagree. there's two main factors that I disagree with.
Cooldowns, and whoever has better HPS or whoever's considered a better healer right now tends to be who pressed their cooldowns first and for the right time, rather than did they actually save people during the fight. That's definitely been the case for a while now. The more talented healers that actually know the value of most of their buttons really got swept away by the executables, like the people that are more into the achievement trophy hunting of I want a high parse, and they know the exact timings to press a couple of cooldowns, and bingo bongo, I have high HPS.
One with less healing cooldowns in the game, then Blizzard's gonna make damage, hopefully, less crazy spiky and less dependent on, oh, do you have cooldowns? Or, hey, this ability comes out, you're expected to have healing cooldowns here in order to deal with it.
He briefly mentions that his hope is Blizzard is going to change the damage profiles. I don't know how far deep I want to go into this. That's why I think that we have to be very critical of what Blizzard's saying. They've promised several times to slow healing down, to make more sustained healing come back again, and it's just not been true. The problem here is the truth that I think Blizzard tends to ignore is that Mythic Plus has way more similarities to arena PvP than it does raid. And that's where it becomes they really need to make this branching road choice. Either you start truly considering that and think about, should specs in general have separate Mythic Plus talents the same way PvP has separate talents? I guarantee you can look at the PvP talent list and a lot of them would make a ton of sense in Mythic Plus. That's not a coincidence. That's because Mythic Plus is designed quite similarly to something competitive like Arena. Because similarly, you can look at the PvP talents and say, most of them would be not really usable in raid. They wouldn't make sense. Now then you gotta think about that. In some sense, I think, yeah, Mythic Plus might be way more fun, even Delves, if they just let us use PvP talents in them. On the other hand, they can make the choice to redesign Mythic Plus a bit more so that sustained healing makes more sense, that we don't have that type of issue where it's such a different healing profile that it's very jarring to go from one thing to the other.
You know, there's some cooldowns in the game where, you know, maybe it's Ascendance and you just mash chain heals or something and you can't help but transfer all the healing to the right people. The big thing that I'm interested in is that with less healing cooldowns in the game, you are more focused on actually playing a cleaner rotation.
He's talking about doing a cleaner rotation, but a lot of the changes that Blizzard is making feel very non-rotation. Obviously, my spec was gutted more than a lot of the others. Resto Shaman is getting most of their combo techniques taken away or altered pretty heavily. So where you don't have tidal waves, what is the rotation? You're gonna choose between healing wave, you're gonna choose between chain heal. You know, maybe they'll be changing because they seem to really like Riptide a lot now, but they're doubling down on really weird combo techniques. There's not exactly a clear rotation with what some of the things they're taking away is. So I think that that's kind of a questionable thing.
And so there will be a lot of areas where a skilled player can shine because they're executing their priority system in a lot better of a fashion than a noob. There's still going to be some pre-planning and value as you go into higher keys because, yeah, as a shaman, you might only have Ascendance, but you're summoning ancestors with your healing stream totems. So when you actually cast those totems, matters a huge amount. It matters just as much as how you cast your Cloudburst today, if not more. We'll have to see as it goes into it. So I think there's still a number of different ways that they're able to make the game really skillful and really challenging.
Okay. Well, okay. What he just said, I'm trying not to crash out a little bit. Now AutomaticJak is gonna make me need therapy. I mostly agreed with him at this point, I think, but this is a tough one. And the example he decides to use is the opposite, like that is the problem. As a Resto Shaman player, not happy with Blizzard's intended changes to Resto Shaman. It's pretty bad. Not to say that the other healers have it good, but the situation's pretty different. I mean, what they're removing is so core and iconic to the class. It would be pretty similar to removing things like, you know, like Light of Dawn or Wog from Holy Paladin, like removing Prayer of Mending from Holy Priest. There's a lot of things to it that are like, through all of the changes of all the expansions, we continually had these things. So it's really crazy to see what they've decided to remove. What AutomaticJak is talking about with the totems and summoning ancestors, he's saying it might even matter more when you cast your totems compared to Cloudburst. Now, that's really interesting for him to say, because he's previously saying that he is all for the sustained healing type of thing and stop pre-planning. What he's talking about is the exact problem, right? We don't want to have that overimportance of I'm nervous about when I cast my healing stream totem. And that's what I was talking about with BFA. BFA, Cloudburst still existed, and it was a much more sustained healing. So Cloudburst is not in conflict with that idea. It actually supports it extremely well. From AutomaticJak's end, if it comes to pass, that's really bad. That is in conflict, and we will once again have Blizzard saying we're trying to do more sustained healing and slow things down, and we get to the expansion and it's just not. It's just an endless loop, and that's why stuff like this needs to change. They need to learn from it. You don't want to have to time your totems like that. When they had the season where when you drop a totem, it chucks out a chain heal, that was super awesome, and actually you didn't time it that far. I believe it was Castle Nathria, and even with the spikiness and pre-planning of Castle Nathria, it just wasn't worth saying, okay, I better hold this totem so that I can get a chain heal out of it. You just want a passive support. I am struggling with the idea that having Ancestor Summon with your totem is what is going to be the replacement of Cloudburst, and possibly that's why they are removing Cloudburst. I think there's many potential reasons why they might be removing Cloudburst, which I'm going to probably make a similar video just about Resto Shaman soon. I'm hoping that that's not necessarily the case, that it's just so important for when your ancestor is out, because I think that that might be a confusion of what else is at play, especially considering like ancestors only feel crazy right now because the tier set of the War Within Season 3 is just making your ancestors feel crazy sometimes. And I would have to look at the talents again of what they're changing to really see if they are empowering ancestors in that way that it's going to be super, super strong. I'm very curious what else will happen, but I'm trying not to go into a Resto Shaman rant. I just strongly disagree that what he just said about Resto Shaman right now is just, it's just not correct. I really disagree with him a lot. I think Blizzard needs more direction, and they need to have more conversations, and they need to think about it a lot more.
And when it comes to the burst damage, one side of the coin is how many healing cooldowns are available. The other side of the coin is something we've talked about a ton on this channel, and it's the amount of defensives that you have access to. Now, this has been really uneven from what I've seen so far in the alpha changes, but it seems like there's a decent amount of defensive pruning going on in the game so far. I will say it's unequal and unfair from what I've seen. Warlock, correct me if I'm wrong, still has incredibly insane amounts of defensives, and it has that spell reflect effect just tied into your Fort Brew. And that's, you know, it's not nothing, but I mean,
they are combining a good amount of things, which is very interesting.
And having the spell reflect is, you know, and now Stone Bulwark wasn't an amazing cooldown or anything, but it, you know, losing the ability.
Well, they added it
because
because Shaman didn't necessarily have the defenses necessary to deal with certain damage profiles.
Defensive or something like that.
Thinking of like the last Wasp no could
semi-equal level in terms of our defensive value. So it's unequal.
They're basically all not necessarily needed when you do have sustained healing.
I think that they should. Even if it means that they're going to give us like more stamina, or this class takes a little less magic, this class like takes a little bit less fizz.
Shaman does have other buffs, and it is more focused on
because when you have lots of active
actually healing versus supportive abilities and defensive. So it's not the worst thing.
That makes it really hard for Blizzard.
Over time, maybe it just isn't always clear what a class is capable of, but that's a skill thing. But that's a skill ceiling thing.
80% effectively or something like that. But you healers will know There's a very big difference between a shaman hitting Astral Shift before damage happens and hitting Astral Shift at 10% life after they've taken all the damage. It's hugely different in terms of how their health bars go. And the more they reduce the active defensives that players have on hand, I think the smoother the damage is going to be as a result.
It is a difference of intention with defensives, and I guess the biggest point that I keep going into is that damage profile thing. Once again, if we go back to BFA, defensives were not to take a massive hit necessarily. I mean, maybe for tanks, but we're just going to talk about healers and DPS mostly. Defensives are definitely in a sustained healing kind of era, sustained damage. It's more of a situation of my healers kind of need to catch up, something else happened, and a mistake. That's when people would pop defensives to give healers time. That's very different than the last few expansions at this point, where defensives were required prior to a mechanic, and that made kind of everyone in the party a healer, because now everyone was responsible for the enemy cooldown timeline. That's not a very common or intuitive thing for people outside of being a tank or a healer. And plus, for DPS, it doesn't really fit into what they're doing. So for them to shift and be like, oh, this mechanic is happening in 10 seconds, I better have my defensive ready, versus really doing their DPS rotation, it just doesn't fit, and that's why it's been an issue for so long. Defensives are not inherently a problem. They had to add a bunch in order to deal with the damage profiles that they put into the game. Now, removing them doesn't solve that. They still have to change how they design fights and incoming damage and how that happens.
They did remove things like greater invis's damage reduction for mage. They removed mass barrier, which I'm really surprised by as well. I mentioned earlier,
I was kind of surprised they removed mass barrier too, but I think that a lot of mages don't even like that.
Hey,
so
hit all your
it's whatever.
Together at the same time, and then we'll do it again, 30 seconds later. Now, with all the glazing that I did earlier, I still do have some concerns going into the new expansion.
Like a
They've
donut?
talked about, but they are also adding Apex talents into the mix. And one of my biggest concerns is having the Apex talents turning into another round of like proc effects to track. We'll see. I've already seen a lot of like passive healing effects baked into Holy Priest, for example. There still is some more bloat. And I think that's sort of inevitable with them constantly adding new talents and new abilities and to sort of keep things fresh. I am a little concerned about where mana is going to be, but we won't really know how that's going to look until we get the chance to play it a lot. But the problem that I don't necessarily is that in beta,
I don't think it's necessarily bloat. I think the talent trees are too many options, too many points, too many different directions of what you can power up. Kind of what I mentioned earlier of, you look at the Renaissance Shaman tree and you're like, well, am I focused on making my Riptide stronger? How does that interact with if I want to make my chain heal stronger? All this stuff, and like, what is Wellspring for, right? Obviously, they're pruning Resto Shaman a lot, but I think that those issues still exist where you're like, well, what am I doing? Like, what am I powering up? And there's just so many different directions with all these things. I think that's where some of the bloat comes from, is in offering too many directions, too many options, trying to be too flexible in how people are allowed to play a spec. You're actually making it worse. And things do need to be curated. They don't have to be as curated as the super simple talents that came once upon a time. I believe Mop. We still had that in Shadowlands, right? The overly simple tree, not even really a tree. You just picked a few things, right? Yes, those were too simple, maybe. But did things kind of feel better then because you didn't have too many options and you knew how each row interacted with the core of what you were supposed to do? Yes. And the problem with these talent trees is that there isn't really a core to what you're supposed to do. And that's where Blizzard needs to start in order to have what is a more accessible game. You have to say, this is the core and identity of a class. Here's a tree to kind of play with that. And I think that in a lot of ways, for a lot of specs, I know that some specs had issues, but that's kind of what the Azerite armor did in BFA. If you recall, a lot of talents from BFA ended up on that Resto Shaman tree because they were really cool. You could get your healing rain to be bigger, your spouting spirits did instant healing, all these cool, interesting interactions that just slightly took up a notch of what you already had at a core, that you already had as an identity. That's really what a talent tree should look more like versus trying to find your identity in a talent tree. And that's what makes the game feel bloated and complicated from my eyes, and if I were to redesign the game.
And they usually focus more on, is everybody doing enough healing compared to each other, versus how does this spec feel with mana, how does that spec feel with mana, especially when it comes into dungeon content, because that doesn't seem like it gets as much attention for tuning.
I am kind of unclear to what extent they actually want mana management to come back for healers. I'm not quite sure.
On stream, and I'm just like amazed at how insane.
That was one of the stresses of BFA, I remember, for some people, but it felt a lot better in BFA to manage your mana than all these expansions afterward, where does it matter? For most, it doesn't. Like, it just kind of feels lame.
Definitely go farther when it comes to some of the pruning and some of the adjustments with defensives. I think, especially when it comes to the defensives that other specs are bringing to the table, you know, like the Zephyrs, the AMZs, rallies, all those things coming in. I think lenience as well for Disc Priest could definitely be like removed in its entirety. They're still kind of focused on having Aura Mastery stay where it is. I would love it if like Aura Mastery felt strong, but like
I just thought Aura Mastery was cute.
But they absolutely love those like little bits of damage reduction that sort of add up. But all those things make for really swingy behavior as to, do you have this thing? Do you not have this thing? And when you stack all these things on top of each other, if you keep removing blocks, you know,
I both understand where he's coming from, but disagree with him a bit, because he might not see that nuance that I'm talking about, where it more so matters how, like, the raid is designed. I believe that things like Devotion Aura added more variety to raid groups in BFA, that I saw a wider variety of people just playing what they wanted to play. Whereas now I think we see a much bigger drop. Even within a class, by far and away, a majority is picking one spec. Even a class where all 3 specs are DPS. When things are a bit more sustained damage, it becomes a bit more pleasant to accept saying Devotion Aura actually does kind of matter. And I think that people digested that better, saying, well, the damage is happening through the fight, so that's reduced damage all the time. Every single second is reduced damage. That's kind of how it felt in like Battle of Dazar'alor. And I mean, Ny'alotha had quite a lot of ticking damage. I think that he overemphasizes defensive. So I'm both agreeing with him and disagreeing. I saw way higher defensive usage way back when that was the case of, I just want to live so that my healer can heal me, versus I need to know when this ability is going to come out and then I hit my defensive. So it's not necessarily the number of defensives. I think those things are fine. When there's always damage, it just always feels like a good idea to press it. And so it has more flexibility. With more flexibility, there are more moments that are like, I'm glad I did that thing. Yeah, I mean, I have disdain for defensives too, because it feels like, yeah, everyone can just technically live without me for a lot of content. I think you have to separate where, if Blizzard makes the changes that they're supposed to make, the defensive's not so bad.
Really noticeable when you don't have this spec or this cooldown in your raid group, and damage is going to feel way burstier, way worse as a result.
I don't think so. I think that when you have the sustained damage, it became, you know, way back when. Am I making myself sound old though? Way back when, I was definitely more AOTC minded. I've come back to AOTC and it's a very different world now with all these philosophy changes of design. I can see a clear difference. I mean, there used to be far more acceptance of basically having 4 healers, but they were all different. Now it feels like we are going to stack healers. We're going to take the one that can just heal us through the one damage event or whatever. The sustained damage does allow for better variety. I disagree somewhat on this point.
Together. One of the biggest things is that, yes, Mythic Plus is infinitely scaling content, so it's always going to get into one-shot territory eventually, but it's a spectrum. It's definitely a wide spectrum. When you had like plus 30 keystones before the keystone squish, it took a lot longer to get to that level where people were starting to get wombo comboed and just one banged out of nowhere. When it comes to a whole expansion, there's a lot of power that Blizzard likes to add through tier sets, trinkets, all that great stuff, which feels really satisfying when you get them. But in order for them to also make damage not insanely bursty the way it is in Manaforge Omega right now, they need to have enough runway space, basically. What they did in Battle for Azeroth is you would gain additional stamina and power as you were increasing in your neck levels. But basically, you would gain more power, and what I mean by power is you would push up health bars faster as you got more gear and more upgrades with your borrowed power, faster than you'd get stamina. They'd both be going up, but you would see the player power rise at a faster rate than your stamina would.
In BFA, a lot of balancing was actually done extremely well. It just wasn't the most in-your-face balancing. I'm glad and fascinated that he brought up the neck, because the neck is exactly, I think, what we're talking about here, that you are gradually going up in power, but so is your stamina, and there's this balance to all of it where you're feeling stronger, but it's not getting out of whack. I think that's a really good point. Although, no, I'm fascinated he brought on BFA because in his previous video, he kind of knocks on BFA quite a bit. And I really disagree with that. I think that if you do want Blizzard to do what they're going to say, where it's more sustained healing and damage, you should be looking to BFA and you should be acknowledging more positive points of BFA and separating out stuff that wasn't necessarily a healing balance problem. The issue with BFA is a lot more separate of they were coming off Legion. Legion had an insane power increase that was not sustainable, and it was not a properly designed system. So you have to transition, and they knew that it was bad. So they go into BFA, and unfortunately the starting point of BFA was just too low. And that's where you had problems of discomfort healing in like Mythic Plus especially. It was really an overall, like, where did we start power level wise? I think when you scaled up and you progressed, things felt better. And I don't want to fault the overall system for just like where the starting stats were, because they had to squish stats at the start of BFA. So I don't necessarily think that healing was bad in BFA. And I think we should be looking to it as a actually very successful system for letting players have a good time and letting it be accessible.
The benefit of rising them both together, though, was that it didn't get out of whack too quickly or anything. And as a result, it still felt like healing could be really satisfying throughout all of raid progression, because you could still have rot encounters, you could still have lots of ticking damage, and Ny'alotha was extraordinarily well known for the ticking damage on a ton of different encounters, especially on things like N'Zoth. So what my biggest concern is, do they have enough runway to make sure that they can keep on increasing stamina while still increasing player power?
BFA raid healing was the last time I had an extreme amount of funny healing.
Absolutely help is if
they fucked with BFA.
Probably the biggest thing that I've been preaching for years is adding some kind of buff to healing in 5-mans. That way, the starting point is that you heal a little bit faster in 5-mans, so it's a little bit more reliable to push up health bars quickly. And then you're a little bit slower in raids where you have 4 or 5 healers to help you in the process of healing up health bars. And then as they sort of rise together throughout the expansion, you still feel comfortable healing solo while not pushing up health bars and yo-yoing them crazy fast in a raid, because everybody can top off quickly thanks to 5-man tuning. In a lot of BFA, they did not have good 5-man tuning. There was only a couple specs that actually could like heal high-end content, and it wasn't until deep into the Ny'alotha, Corruption, all the Essences season where multiple different healers.
I'm very surprised that more and more people are suggesting this.
That's still a concern.
To
I still think
have
that,
a different
way that they've adopted a
amount of power healing in 5-mans versus raid
content, and then making it scale lower when it comes to raid content. They've changed it around going into the Midnight expansion, but they're still keeping that general core concept. I think that's a great thing that they should be baking into every healer spec in the game, and I think it would improve a lot of the
So I definitely think that tuning overall power differently between dungeons and raid is not a good idea. Definitely not a good idea with current philosophies. So for a long time, Blizzard talked about their philosophy of they struggled with how different PvP talents should be or how different spells should be in PvP, because they felt like they didn't want players to be confused between content. And that's a tricky situation, right? Obviously they have PvP talents now, and we can all recognize it's a PvP talent, so you don't have it in raid or dungeons. And I mostly agree with that sentiment. It could be a band-aid fix until they figure out what they want to do, but it's not sustainable. And they have to be very careful about it if they implement that, which they have in very small measures, where, for example, Healing Tide Totem is stronger in dungeons currently than raid, to kind of even things out in the meantime. But the truth is that more sustainable design is that they need to make better choices about acknowledging, do we want Mythic Plus to actually be this competitive thing? And like I said, it currently is much more similar to arena PvP than raid. So having Mythic Plus talents or just having PvP talents be enabled for small group content instead could make a measurable difference in them not having to alter things like Healing Tide Totem or the overall power of a player, rather than giving them access to things that just helps the different style of content. I think the issue right now is that Mythic Plus is way too connected to raid. Way too connected. Mythic Plus has very regularly at this point been the primary way and means to get the best gear. It is how you gear if you are doing better content. I don't want to start ranting by accident. That's a huge problem. I get kind of upset about it sometimes because we went through a whole thing of I shouldn't have to PvP to get certain things in order to raid. And yet we have a philosophy right now of you have to Mythic Plus in order to raid effectively. That doesn't add up. That's not cool. And I don't think that Blizzard understands Mythic Plus is not the same as doing heroic dungeons in Wrath. They're treating it very similarly, or pretty much the same, but it's not. Mythic Plus is a separate endgame content up there between PvP, raid, and you can include kind of world content now if you consider delves to be endgame content, which I think is fair to do. So you kind of have these 4 branches, and everything else is separate except Mythic Plus is so important to do other endgame content. But that's not how endgame content should interact. That's not easy to design around, and that's kind of why they're failing to design through it over and over again. Heroic dungeons in Wrath did function better when it was a means of leading to endgame content, where it was an intermediary between questing and then you could do some dungeons, which were kind of on the same level of getting gear from questing, just slightly better. And then you could get to endgame content and just occasionally do some dungeons, which BFA functioned like that a lot more. There was a much more gradual ramp in how you can gear to go raid, and then you didn't have to do a lot of dungeons outside of raid to be effective in raid. You mostly were gearing through raid back in BFA if you wanted to raid. The current design is kind of an issue both with Mythic Plus and the Great Vault, obviously. That's a whole separate conversation of you'd have to fix those things if you are going to start saying healers are going to feel different and have different power feelings in dungeons versus raid. I think that's a very dangerous design decision. And if you're talking about trying to handle new healers, how easily are you explaining to them why they feel stronger sometimes in dungeons, right? It's a complicated mathematical tuning that is not entirely necessary if you understand the design conflicts that are happening with endgame content.
Every healer spec in the game, and I think it would improve a lot of the gameplay as well. But overall, they kind of covered a lot of the bases I had in my video last month, and you can go check it out if you want to, just to see what my thoughts were before these changes were made. I'm really satisfied with the direction that they're going. I think it's inevitable that like a huge company is gonna like move at kind of glacial speed as they're heading in the right direction, but I think it's certainly trending better than Dragonflight and better than the War Within.
It's interestingly trusting when I'm not sure that the Blue Post supports that they're genuinely going to do it this time around. They promised quite often between the last 3 expansions, and they've never done it yet. Ay, ay.